In 1665, in the small Dutch city of Delft, a painter working in near-total obscurity picked up a brush and created one of the most recognizable faces in the history of art. He didn't know it at the time. Nobody did. There was no gallery opening, no critics circling, no sense that anything remarkable had happened. Just a man, a canvas, and a girl who turned her head over her shoulder to look directly at whoever was watching. We don't know her name. We don't know if she was real or half-real or entirely invented. There's no letter that mentions her, no receipt, no diary entry, nothing in 3.5 centuries of archives that tells us who she was. And yet her face has been reproduced more times than almost any other painting in human history, on posters, on book covers, on the walls of people who've never set foot in a museum. So how does a painting with no name, no story, and almost no historical record become one of the most famous images on Earth? Part of the answer, as we'll see, has to do with pure technical skill. The way Vermeer handled light, texture, and color was genuinely ahead of most of his contemporaries. But skill alone doesn't usually create this kind of lasting fascination. Plenty of technically brilliant paintings from this exact period sit quietly in museum storage, admired by specialists and ignored by almost everyone else. Something else is going on here, something closer to a psychological hook than a purely visual one, and untangling it means going back to the very beginning. Who Vermeer actually was, why he painted the way he did, and why this particular canvas, out of only 36 or so surviving works, became the one the entire world fell in love with. That's the mystery we're unpacking today. This is the story. Meet Johannes Vermeer. If you didn't know his name walking into this video, you're not alone. For almost 200 years after his death, most people didn't. Vermeer worked in Delft, a modest trading city in the Dutch Republic, at a time when Amsterdam was the glittering center of the art world, and painters like Rembrandt were already becoming legends in their own lifetimes. Vermeer wasn't chasing that kind of fame. He worked slowly, sometimes agonizingly slowly, spending months layering thin glazes of paint to get exactly the effect of light he wanted on a single surface. That slowness meant he simply couldn't produce very much. Over the course of his career, art historians have only been able to confidently attribute somewhere around 34 to 36 surviving paintings to him, an almost absurdly small output compared to his contemporaries, some of whom produced hundreds of works in the same span of time. He wasn't lazy. He was, by most accounts, a perfectionist working in a genre: quiet domestic interiors, women reading letters, pouring milk, tuning instruments, that didn't command the same prices as grand historical or religious scenes. To make ends meet, Vermeer also worked as an art dealer, buying and selling other painters' work alongside his own. It wasn't enough. When he died in 1675, at just 43 years old, he left behind a wife, Katharina, and 11 surviving children, and a mountain of debt so large that Katharina had to petition the city to be released from responsibility for it. She even tried to pay off a baker using 2 of Vermeer's own paintings as currency. For nearly 2 centuries after that, Vermeer essentially vanished from art history. His paintings were misattributed to other artists, sold cheaply, passed around without much fanfare. It wasn't until the 1860s, when a French art critic named Théophile Thorberger became obsessed with tracking down every Vermeer he could find, that the painter was rediscovered and slowly, carefully, reassembled into the reputation we know today. In other words, the man who painted one of the most famous faces in art history spent most of his own life, and nearly 2 centuries after it, as a nobody. Picture the studio where this painting was likely made. Vermeer worked from a room in his house on the Oude Langendijk in Delft, with a large window facing north. A deliberate choice, because north-facing light doesn't shift dramatically throughout the day the way south-facing light does. It stays cool, even, and consistent, which mattered enormously to a painter obsessed with capturing exactly how light falls across a face or a piece of fabric. Conservators and art historians who've studied Vermeer's technique believe he sometimes used a device called a camera obscura, essentially a darkened box or room that projects an image of the outside world onto a surface. The same basic principle behind a modern camera, just centuries before photography existed. Whether he traced directly from these projections or simply used them to study how light and shadow behaved is still debated. What's not debated is that his paintings have an almost photographic quality to them that was unusual for his time. Soft focus in the background, sharp clarity where the eye is meant to land, tiny points of light dabbed onto highlights to make them shimmer. His process was slow by design. Vermeer ground his own pigments, or had them ground, and mixed them fresh rather than relying on pre-made paints. He built his paintings in layers, a rough underpainting first, blocking in the major shapes and values, then thin translucent glazes on top, one after another, each one drying before the next was applied. This is part of why we only have 36 or so surviving works from him. Each painting could take him weeks or months, worked on in stolen hours around his other responsibilities as a dealer and a father to a growing household. It's worth noting that Delft, the city where Vermeer worked his entire life, would later become internationally famous for something else entirely. Delft blue pottery, the distinctive white and cobalt blue ceramics that turned this same city into a global byword for one very specific, very saturated shade of blue. Vermeer died before Delftware production reached its later peak of international fame, but there's a nice symmetry in the fact that a city so thoroughly associated with one exact blue would also produce a painter whose single most famous work hinges almost entirely on a shockingly similar, equally saturated blue pigment in a woman's turban. Somewhere in a room very much like this, sometime in the mid-1660s, Vermeer set up a canvas, arranged a model in an exotic costume that had nothing to do with everyday Dutch dress, and began building, layer by careful layer. Here's the detail that surprises most people the first time they hear it. Strictly speaking, girl with a pearl earring isn't a portrait. In the 17th century, the word portrait had a specific meaning. It referred to a painting of a real, identified, usually paying individual. Portraits were commissions. Wealthy merchants, town officials, and their families paid painters to capture their likeness for posterity, complete with symbols of their status, fine clothing, jewelry, the tools of their trade. This painting belongs to a completely different category that was popular in the Dutch Republic at the time, called a tronie, from an Old Dutch word roughly meaning face. A tronie wasn't about capturing a specific identified sitter. It was a study of an expression, a type of character, an exotic costume, a particular quality of light on skin. Painters used tronies almost like sketchbooks for the human face, practice pieces that let them experiment freely, without the pressure of pleasing a paying client who wanted to look dignified and recognizable. That distinction changes everything about how we should read this painting. Vermeer likely wasn't trying to answer the question of who this person was. He was asking a completely different question. What happens if I capture someone in the exact instant of turning to look at you, lips slightly parted as if she's about to speak, eyes wide and direct, in a way that was almost startlingly informal for the period? Most formal portraits of the era show sitters facing forward, rigid, composed, staring past the viewer with practiced dignity. This girl looks directly at you, caught mid-motion, as if you just said her name and she turned to answer. Art historians point out that this immediacy, the sense of a captured moment rather than a posed sitting, is part of what makes the painting feel almost startlingly modern, centuries before photography would make candid images a common visual language. Vermeer was essentially inventing a kind of visual snapshot using nothing but oil paint and glazes, decades before anyone had a camera capable of freezing a fraction of a second in time. And because it's a tronie and not a commissioned portrait, there was likely never a record kept of who modeled for it in the first place. Clients who commissioned formal portraits appear in city ledgers, guild records, family archives. A model who simply sat for a study, possibly a household member, Possibly someone paid a small fee for an afternoon's work, would have left no such trail, which means the blank space at the center of this 350-year mystery might not be an accident of lost records at all. It might be built into the very category of painting this is. Now look closely at what she's wearing. That striking blue and gold fabric wrapped around her head is not something any ordinary Dutch woman in Delft would have worn walking to market in 1665. Dutch fashion of the period tended toward modest, structured clothing, white linen caps, dark wool, high collars. A loosely draped silk turban in vivid blue with a dramatic yellow drape falling down one side was, for a Delft audience, exotic, foreign, almost theatrical. This wasn't unusual for Vermeer or his contemporaries, though. Dutch traders of the era, through the Dutch East India Company, were bringing back textiles, spices, and luxury goods from across Asia and the Middle East, and a fascination with the exotic East had worked its way into Dutch art as a kind of visual shorthand for luxury, mystery, and worldliness, even though most Dutch painters, including Vermeer, had likely never traveled anywhere near the regions they were referencing. It was costume as fantasy, not costume as documentation. That matters because it tells us Vermeer wasn't recording a real outfit a real person wore on a real day. He was constructing an image piece by piece, choosing fabric, choosing color, choosing how the light would catch the folds of silk, the way a film director stages a scene rather than the way a documentarian captures one. Every choice, from the improbable size of the pearl to the foreign drape of the turban, was deliberate. Nothing in this painting happened by accident, which makes the total absence of information about the sitter herself even stranger. Vermeer clearly controlled every visual detail in this image except, it seems, the one detail that would have told us who she was. It's also worth pointing out how differently color functioned in Dutch art at the time compared to how we think about it today. A painter reaching for that particular saturated blue wasn't making a casual aesthetic choice, it was closer to a financial and symbolic statement, since the pigment behind it was genuinely one of the most expensive materials available to any artist in Europe. Combining an eye-catching, costly blue with a foreign-coated garment on an anonymous sitter is a strange, almost contradictory set of choices. Enormous visual investment poured into a figure Vermeer apparently felt no need to identify for posterity at all. That contradiction, spending real expense and real craft on someone whose name didn't seem to matter to him, is part of what keeps art historians returning to this single small canvas centuries later. And then there's the object the entire painting is named after, the pearl. Look at its size relative to her earlobe. It's enormous. Heavy enough, if it really were a natural pearl of that size and quality, to have been one of the single most valuable objects a person in Delft could own in the 1660s. Natural pearls of that scale were vanishingly rare in the 17th century, harvested by hand from oysters with no reliable way to predict size or quality, which made large, symmetrical, high-luster pearls almost priceless. That's exactly why a number of art historians and gemologists who've studied the painting closely have raised a pretty simple, pretty compelling doubt. Is it even a real pearl at all? Several researchers have pointed out that the proportions look physically implausible for a natural pearl of the period, and have suggested Vermeer was likely painting a glass or tin bead, a cheap, mass-producible imitation that Dutch glassmakers were already skilled at producing by this point in history, coated or polished to catch light in a way that reads as luminous and precious on canvas, even though the real object might have been worth almost nothing. If that's true, it reframes the entire painting. Vermeer wasn't documenting actual wealth, he was documenting the visual language of wealth, using a handful of careful brushstrokes, a bright highlight here, a soft reflected glow there, to convince the viewer's eye that they're looking at something priceless, regardless of what the object actually was in the artist's hand. In a sense, the pearl is the perfect symbol for the entire painting, something that reads as absolutely certain and specific at first glance, and dissolves into ambiguity the moment you actually try to pin it down. There's a nice technical detail here, too. Vermeer achieves the illusion of the pearl almost entirely through just 2 or 3 small strokes of white and gray paint against the dark shadow of her neck. No elaborate detail, no fussy rendering of facets or texture. It's one of the most famous examples in art history of how a painter can suggest enormous material richness using almost nothing at all, relying on the viewer's brain to fill in the rest. So who was she? This is the question that's driven 3.5 centuries of speculation, and the honest answer is, nobody actually knows, and it's entirely possible nobody ever will. There is no letter that names her, no receipt for a commission, no entry in Delft's civic or guild records that says who was painted and when. For almost every other painting from this era with a known sitter, some kind of paper trail survives. A will, a family record, a mention in a merchant's ledger. For this painting, there's silence. That silence hasn't stopped people from guessing, though, and over the centuries a handful of theories have taken hold. One of the most persistent points to Vermeer's own household. He and Katharina had 11 surviving children, and one daughter, Maria, was roughly the right age in the mid-1660s to have modeled for a study like this. Some art historians find this plausible simply on practical grounds. A painter working slowly on a trony wouldn't need to pay a professional model or arrange an elaborate sitting. A family member available at home would have been the easiest, cheapest option. A second theory points toward domestic help. Wealthier Delft households in this period commonly employed servants, and it's entirely possible an unnamed young woman working in or near Vermeer's home sat for the painting in exchange for a small fee, her presence never formally recorded, because servants, unlike patrons, generally weren't the kind of people whose names made it into surviving archives. A third theory suggests a patron's daughter, someone from a family wealthy enough to have some connection to Vermeer's circle of buyers and dealers, but whose specific identity has simply been lost, along with countless other records destroyed by fires, floods, and the general erosion of 3.5 centuries of Dutch history. And then there's a fourth position, one that a significant number of contemporary art historians actually lean toward, that there was no single specific her at all. Remember, this is a trony, not a commissioned portrait, a study of a face, an expression, a costume. It's entirely possible Vermeer worked from more than one model, or idealized certain features, or simply invented parts of the face from imagination and technical skill, rather than direct observation. Under this theory, hunting for the real girl behind the painting may be a slightly misguided question to begin with, like trying to find the real person behind a character in a novel, when the character was assembled from pieces of several real people and plenty of pure invention. It's also worth understanding just how thorough Dutch Golden Age record-keeping generally was, because that's exactly what makes this particular silence so unusual. The Dutch Republic in the 17th century kept meticulous civic records, property transactions, guild memberships, marriage registers, baptismal records, tax rolls. Historians researching other Delft painters of the period have been able to reconstruct fairly detailed pictures of their households, their apprentices, even their disputes with neighbors, purely from surviving paperwork. Vermeer's own life is reasonably well documented by comparison, precisely because he shows up in these kinds of records as a taxpayer, a guild member, a debtor, a model for a trony, especially an unpaid family member or a servant, simply had far less reason to appear in any official document at all, which makes the blank space around this specific painting less mysterious in a supernatural sense, and more just an accurate reflection of whose lives got written down in the 17th century and whose didn't. What's genuinely remarkable is that none of these theories can be proven or fully ruled out. 3.5 centuries of art historians, archivists, and researchers with access to increasingly sophisticated tools have not been able to close this gap. The most honest answer any expert can give you today is the same one they could have given 100 years ago. We don't know. A novelist published a book that did what 3 centuries of art historians couldn't. Gave the girl in the painting a full name, a personality, a voice, and a complete backstory. The novel imagines her as a servant girl who enters Vermeer's household, becomes fascinated by his work, and develops a quiet, charged, unspoken tension with the painter himself, one that eventually leads to the moment the painting is made. The book became an enormous bestseller, translated into dozens of languages, and in 2003 it was adapted into a well-regarded film starring Scarlett Johansson as the girl and Colin Firth as Vermeer. The film leaned into the same imagined romance, the same hushed domestic tension, the same sense of forbidden closeness between painter and model. Between the book and the film, millions of people were introduced to this painting for the first time, and for a lot of them, the fictional servant girl story is the only version of events they've ever heard. That's worth pausing on because it's a genuinely interesting case study in how a compelling piece of fiction can quietly become mistaken for history simply by being the loudest, most emotionally satisfying story available. The novelist has been fairly open about the fact that the story is speculative fiction built around a genuine historical gap. She's said in interviews that she was drawn to write about the painting precisely because so little is known, which gave her the creative freedom to imagine a plausible human story rather than being constrained by documented facts. There's nothing wrong with that as a piece of art in its own right. It's a well-crafted, emotionally effective novel and film. But it's worth being precise about the difference between what we know and what we've been told in fictional form. No historical document supports a romantic tension between Vermeer and a servant. No record confirms she was a servant at all. The quiet, charged story so many people associate with this painting is a talented novelist's invention. While novelists were free to imagine, scientists were busy actually examining the physical painting itself, and in 2018, a major multi-year research initiative brought the painting into a specially built mobile laboratory at the Mauritshuis Museum in The Hague, where it's been housed for most of its modern history, and subjected it to an extraordinary level of technical analysis. Researchers used macro X-ray fluorescence scanning, which can map the chemical elements in paint layers across an entire canvas, along with high-resolution infrared imaging, digital microscopy, and 3D surface scanning, tools that let conservators essentially look underneath and inside layers of paint that have been sitting undisturbed for over 3 centuries. What they found reshaped how we understand the painting. For one, digital microscopy revealed that the girl originally had visible eyelashes, delicately painted, which have simply worn away or degraded to the point of invisibility to the naked eye over the centuries. A detail so fine that even experienced conservators hadn't previously identified it. The bigger discovery involved the background. For as long as most people have known this painting, it's been famous for its stark, flat, almost featureless black backdrop, a void that throws every ounce of attention onto her face and the pearl. The 2018 research revealed that this black background wasn't what Vermeer actually painted. Chemical analysis showed traces of a deep green pigment, and researchers concluded the original background almost certainly depicted a heavy green curtain, with folds and texture, hanging behind her, a much more dimensional, staged setting than the flat darkness we see today. That green pigment, made from a copper-based compound common in the period, is chemically unstable and prone to darkening and losing its color over long stretches of time, especially when exposed to light. Over 3.5 centuries, it appears to have degraded into the near-black void that generations of viewers assumed was always there, always intentional, always part of the painting's iconic minimalism. This is a genuinely important thing to sit with. The version of this painting that has inspired novels, films, museum pilgrimages, and hundreds of millions of reproductions is not, technically, the painting Vermeer actually made. We've spent 3.5 centuries falling in love with a kind of accidental collaboration between Vermeer's brush and the slow chemistry of pigment decay. The famous emptiness behind her wasn't a bold artistic choice to strip away all distraction. It was, at least in part, simply time doing what time does to unstable 17th century paint. So here's where 3.5 centuries of looking actually leaves us. We know, with a fair amount of confidence, that we will probably never recover her name. The historical record that would answer that question either never existed in the first place, given that this was a trony rather than a commissioned portrait, or it was lost somewhere across 350 years of fires, floods, wars, and the ordinary erosion of paper archives. Both the 2018 scientific research and centuries of art historical scholarship have told us a great deal about how this painting was made, what materials were used, and even what it originally looked like. But neither science nor scholarship has been able to answer the one question most viewers actually want answered. And there's a case to be made that this isn't really a failure of research. It might be the entire reason the painting still has this kind of pull on people. A named, documented portrait of a specific 17th century Dutch woman would be a historical curiosity, interesting to specialists, a nice example of period costume and technique. But a face with no name, caught in an unguarded, intimate moment, looking directly out at you across 3.5 centuries, becomes something closer to a mirror than a record. Because there's no fixed story attached to her, viewers have been free for 350 years to project their own reading onto that expression. Curiosity, longing, surprise, invitation, defiance, depending entirely on what the viewer brings into the room with them. That's very likely part of why this painting has earned the nickname the Mona Lisa of the North, not because it resembles Leonardo's painting technically, but because both works share this same quality of a fixed, ambiguous expression that seems to shift depending on who's looking at it and how long they stand there. Da Vinci's sitter, at least, has a name and a documented identity. Now let's do what we always do here on this channel. Break the painting down by its palette, because the color choices in this piece are doing more work than almost any other element in it. Start with that turban. The deep, saturated blue is ultramarine, and in the 17th century, ultramarine wasn't just a color, it was one of the single most expensive pigments a painter could buy. True ultramarine was made by grinding lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone that, in Vermeer's era, was mined almost exclusively in a single remote region of what's now Afghanistan and shipped an enormous distance across trade routes to reach European painters. Pound for pound, high-quality ultramarine pigment could cost more than gold. Most painters of the period used it sparingly, for the robes of the Virgin Mary in religious commissions, for tiny accents where a patron was paying specifically for luxury. Vermeer, notoriously, used it liberally throughout his work, including in paintings where he wasn't being paid a premium for it, which is part of why art historians believe he cared more about achieving a specific visual effect than about managing costs efficiently, a habit that may have contributed to the financial trouble his family faced by the end of his life. Then there's the warm ochre and flesh tones across her skin, earth pigments, far cheaper and more common, made from naturally occurring iron oxide clays. The contrast matters. An expensive, imported, borderline extravagant blue sitting directly against cheap, humble, everyday ochre. That contrast is part of what makes the painting feel simultaneously intimate and opulent at the same time. And finally, the background, which, as we now know from the 2018 research, was originally a deep, dimensional green curtain that has chemically degraded into the flat, near-black void we see today. Whether Vermeer intended that stark black emptiness or not, it's become one of the defining features of the painting, as the world has experienced it for the last century or more. Nothing to compete with her face, nothing to place her in a specific room or moment, just an infinite dark field that makes the blue, the pearl, and the skin practically glow. There's one more color detail worth mentioning because it ties back to something we touched on earlier: the tiny white highlight on the pearl itself. Conservators who've studied the brushwork up close note that Vermeer achieves it with what amounts to just a couple of confident strokes of lead white, placed with extraordinary precision against the darker gray-brown tones of the earring's shadowed underside. It's a masterclass in how little information the human eye actually needs to read an object as three-dimensional, reflective, and valuable. Remove that single highlight, and the pearl reads as flat and lifeless. Add it back, and the whole illusion snaps into place instantly. It's a tiny, almost throwaway detail on the canvas, and it might be doing more work than any other single brushstroke in the entire painting. 3 colors, essentially, carrying the entire emotional weight of the piece. No elaborate background, no supporting cast, no ornate detail beyond the turban and the earring. That kind of restraint is much harder to pull off than it looks. Remove almost everything, and every remaining choice has to be exactly right, because there's nowhere left to hide a mistake. So after 3.5 centuries, the scans, the scholarship, the fictional stories that tried to fill in what history left blank, where does that leave us? We may never know her name. We may never know if she was Vermeer's daughter, a servant in his household, a patron's child, or simply an idea he built from imagination and skill rather than a specific living person. And after everything we've covered today, it's worth asking whether that's actually a loss, or whether it's the exact thing that's kept this painting alive in public imagination for 350 years. Long after most other tronies from the same period have been quietly forgotten in museum storage. She was never meant to be a historical record. She was meant to be a study of expression, of light, of the way silk catches a glow, and how 2 small strokes of white paint can convince a viewer's eye they're looking at something priceless. In the process, almost by accident, Vermeer created something that functions less like a photograph of a real 17th century Dutch girl and more like a mirror that's been hanging in a gallery for 3.5 centuries, quietly reflecting back whatever each visitor brings into the room with them. Next time on Brightfull Colours, we're leaving Delft behind for a painting with a very different kind of mystery. One that historians have literally called the most stolen artwork on Earth, taken and recovered so many times across 5 centuries that keeping track of its thefts has become its own strange subgenre of art history. If you found this one interesting, that story is even wilder. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you in the next one.